Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to dive into something, well, pretty disturbing. We're talking about soldiers, those who cross the line from protectors to predators. We're using excerpts from When Warriors Turn Predators, the haunting stories of soldiers who cross the line. Let me tell you, this book is a chilling read. We're going to be exploring the psychology of war, try to understand that razor-thin line between duty and, well, utter depravity.
It's a fascinating and deeply troubling subject. We're not just talking about isolated incidents here. This pattern of soldiers committing atrocities, seemingly defying logic and morality, it pops up again and again throughout history.
Right. And the book kicks off by exploring this idea of the warrior's descent,
Right.
like how military training itself can contribute to this transformation. They talk about how it's literally designed to desensitize soldiers to violence, almost rewiring their brains for killing.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. Taking a human life is the ultimate taboo in civilian life. But for a soldier, it becomes, well, a necessity. Military training aims to overcome that natural aversion to killing, essentially turning it into an automatic response, almost like a reflex. The question is, what happens when that reflex gets triggered in situations where it's not supposed to be?
That's what's so scary. And the excerpts talk about how, for some soldiers, that desensitization, it goes beyond just following orders. They start to, crave the violence, almost become addicted to it, like some switch flips in their minds.
Yeah, that's a chilling way to put it, but it's not far off. There are definitely psychological mechanisms at play here that we need to unpack. Dr. David Grossman, he wrote this book called On Killing, and he argues that the act of killing, even in war, even when justified, it can cause serious psychological trauma. But for a small percentage of individuals, it can actually trigger this, well, almost a perverse pleasure, this thrill that they get hooked on.
So some soldiers might actually be, predisposed to enjoying killing.
I wouldn't say enjoying it necessarily. It's more about being susceptible to the addictive qualities of violence, if that makes sense. And it's not just individual psychology either, right? War itself creates this environment where violence is not only tolerated, but often rewarded.
The book mentions some pretty horrific historical examples to illustrate this. Like the Einsatzgruppen in World War II. Those were the Nazi death squads. They systematically executed millions of civilians.
The Einsatzgruppen were basically given free rein to hunt down and kill anyone the Nazi regime deemed an enemy of the state, mostly Jews. It's a truly horrifying example of how ideology and propaganda can be weaponized, to dehumanize entire groups of people, making it easier to justify their extermination.
And then you've got the My Lai Massacre during the Vietnam War. American soldiers killing hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians.
What strikes me about My Lai is how some of the soldiers involved later admitted to feeling this sense of detachment, almost like it wasn't real. It's like the violence had become so commonplace it was just routine.
But it wasn't just routine for everyone, right? The excerpts talk about how some soldiers, they took pleasure in the killings, even bragged about them.
Yeah, and that points to something even more disturbing, this warping of their moral compass. It's not just blindly following orders anymore, it's finding this sense of power, of control in the middle of all the chaos. It's really a distortion of their values.
So we've got these extreme cases, these historical examples, but the book also looks at more contemporary examples like the Bosnian Genocide in the 90s.
Oh, the Bosnian Genocide, that was just brutal. Ethnic cleansing, mass rape, systematic executions. What's particularly disturbing about this conflict is that so many of the perpetrators weren't just following orders, they were actively participating in the atrocities, and often with this sense of glee, like they were entitled to do it.
So again, we see this pattern of the soldier transforming into a predator. But what exactly is driving this? Is it just a case of bad apples, or are there, broader forces at play?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And frankly, I think it's dangerous to just write these individuals off as inherently evil. We need to look at the context, right? The environment they're operating in, the psychological pressures they're facing. It's way more complicated than just good guys and bad guys.
So it's not just individual psychology, but the whole culture of war itself.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most unsettling takeaways from this book. It forces us to confront this dark side of human nature. The potential for even seemingly ordinary people to commit horrific acts when placed under certain circumstances. It's a real wake-up call.
The book talks a lot about PTSD, but isn't PTSD usually associated with, trauma and fear, not violence?
You're right. For most people, PTSD does manifest as anxiety, flashbacks, nightmares, that kind of thing. But for some, It can lead to increased aggression, even violent outbursts. It's a complex disorder, and we're just starting to understand how wide-ranging its effects can be.
So are you saying PTSD can actually make some soldiers more likely to be violent?
It's not a simple cause and effect relationship. Most veterans with PTSD absolutely do not become violent. But for a small percentage, the trauma they experienced, combined with other factors, it can create this perfect storm that leads to aggression. And understanding those other factors is crucial.
So what other factors are we talking about?
Well, one of the biggest is how soldiers are trained to dehumanize the enemy. That's essential for combat, but it can have some really unintended consequences when those soldiers return home.
You mean like they might struggle to reintegrate into civilian life where obviously killing is not an option?
Exactly. And then you add the pressure of trying to reintegrate into a society that often doesn't understand or acknowledge what they've been through. That can be incredibly isolating.
It's like they're stuck in this no man's land between the world of war and the world of peace, not really belonging to either.
Exactly. And that feeling of isolation, of alienation, it can be incredibly difficult to cope with. For some, violence becomes a way to deal with that, a way to regain some sense of control in a world that feels chaotic and unpredictable. It's a tragic cycle.
It's a really disturbing thought. And it makes you wonder, what can we even do to stop these tragedies from happening?
That's the big question, isn't it? And honestly, there's no easy answer, but I think the first step is acknowledging the problem. We need to recognize the psychological toll that war takes on soldiers, and we need to stop sweeping it under the rug.
So more awareness, more research into PTSD and its effects.
Absolutely. And we need to provide better support for veterans, both during and after their service. It's about creating a system that values their mental health as much as their physical health.
But it's not just about treating the symptoms, right?
Yeah.
We need to address the root causes, the things that contribute to this transformation in the first place.
100%. We need to take a hard look at how we train soldiers, the messages we send them about violence and the enemy. And we absolutely need to hold those who commit war crimes accountable. We can't let these atrocities go unpunished. And on a broader level, we need to foster a culture of empathy and understanding, both within the military and society as a whole.
That's a tall order. But I guess that's what this deep dive is all about, right? Trying to understand these complex issues so we can even begin to address them.
Precisely. And it's a conversation we need to be having, even if it makes us uncomfortable, because the stakes are just too high to ignore it.
Well, this has been a pretty heavy start to our deep dive. We've covered a lot, but we're just scratching the surface here. In part 2, we're going to dig deeper into some of the individual cases from the book and really start to explore those preventative measures that could help, mitigate this whole chilling phenomenon.
We'll also be taking a closer look at the role of society in perpetuating a culture of violence, which is something that we've only briefly touched on today. So stay tuned for that.
All right, picking up where we left off on this exploration of soldiers turning into predators. Last time we were talking about the intense psychological pressures they face and how PTSD plays into all of this. But the excerpts also point out how PTSD doesn't automatically equal violence.
Yeah, that's what makes it so tricky, right? Most people think PTSD, they think flashbacks, nightmares, that kind of thing. But the reality is it can manifest in ways that seem, well, almost the opposite of what you'd expect.
So how does a condition that's rooted in trauma end up fueling aggression? Seems kind of counterintuitive.
It comes down to how the brain processes that trauma, really. Think of it like this. Your internal alarm system, it gets stuck in the on position, constantly scanning for threats, even when there aren't any. The world starts to feel like this hyper-dangerous place. Every interaction, every little thing feels loaded with potential danger.
So it's not just the memories themselves, but it's like the whole experience rewires how they see everything.
Exactly. Normal social cues get misinterpreted. Things that wouldn't faze most people can trigger this huge fight-or-flight response. Their nervous system's in overdrive, ready to explode at any moment. It's a tough way to live.
That makes sense. But the excerpts also talk about how some soldiers, they almost seem to get a thrill from the violence, like they enjoy it. How does that fit with the PTSD picture?
See, that's where things get even more complicated. Human psychology isn't black and white, right? It's not an either situation. It's totally possible for someone to be both deeply traumatized by violence and at the same time feel drawn to it. It's not about good versus evil. It's about these different layers of experience all happening at once.
So you're saying it's possible to be both horrified by something AD, feel this pull towards it at the same time. That's a tough one to grasp, honestly.
Think about it this way. War, as horrific as it is also incredibly stimulating on a very primal level. That adrenaline rush, the danger, the need to make split-second decisions that could mean life or death, it triggers something deep inside us. And for some people, that can be addictive, even if another part of them hates it.
I guess it's similar to those people who are really into extreme sports or risky behavior, right? There's that need to push boundaries, even if it's dangerous.
Precisely. And in war, those boundaries, they get really blurred. Things that would be completely unacceptable back home, in civilian life, they become, well, almost normalized in a combat zone. So you've got this mix of trauma, adrenaline, and this totally distorted sense of what's real and what's not. It's a recipe for disaster.
No wonder things can go so wrong.
Yeah.
And the book doesn't shy away from giving some really specific and frankly terrifying examples of soldiers who went down this dark path. Like David Berkowitz, the son of Sam killer.
Yeah, Berkowitz. His case is one that criminologists still debate today. He was an Army vet, and while you can't say for sure that his time in the service directly caused him to become a serial killer, the question still hangs there. Did something happen during his military experience that planted the seeds for that later violence? It's unsettling to think about.
It really is. And then there's Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. Another veteran, driven to commit this horrific act of terrorism.
McVeigh's a really complex case. You've got this mix of anti-government ideology, personal struggles, but there's no denying that his military background, especially his explosives training, played a direct role in his ability to pull off that attack.
These cases really drive home the point that the effects of war, they can ripple outwards long after the fighting stopped.
Absolutely. And it highlights this urgent need to take a more holistic approach to how we care for veterans. It's not just about physical wounds, it's about those invisible scars, too. The trauma, the moral injuries, helping them find their way back to a world that often feels completely alien to them after what they've experienced.
Okay, so we've talked about the individual psychology of it all. But the excerpts also bring up something else that's, well, a little harder to swallow. The idea that our own society plays a role in this whole thing.
That's right. The book doesn't let us off the hook. It forces us to look at the culture we've created. Think about it. We are surrounded by violence in movies, video games, the news. It's so pervasive that most of us are practically numb to it.
And you're saying this constant exposure to violence, even if it's fictional, could actually be contributing to the problem. That's a little unsettling, to be honest.
It's worth considering, isn't it? Imagine you're someone who's already carrying around a lot of trauma, maybe even using violence as a coping mechanism. Now imagine being bombarded with violent imagery day in and day out. It desensitizes all of us to some extent. But for someone who's already vulnerable, it could be the thing that pushes them over the edge.
So it's like we're, without even realizing it, creating this environment that makes it easier for some people to blur the lines between fantasy and reality when it comes to violence.
It's complicated, for sure. But it's a question we need to be asking ourselves. Are we, as a society, glorifying violence in ways that make it more appealing, more acceptable, especially to those who are already struggling? We might not have all the answers, but we have to start somewhere.
So far, this deep dive has been pretty heavy stuff. You've got the individual psychology, the trauma, the societal influences. It's a lot of forces all pushing in the same dark direction.
It's true. The picture we've painted so far isn't pretty. But the point isn't to just wallow in the bleakness of it all, right? It's about understanding the problem so that we can find solutions, ways to intervene, ways to support those who are at risk, and maybe even change some of those bigger cultural attitudes that are contributing to the problem.
Okay, so let's talk about those solutions. Where do we even begin to tackle something this complex? What can we do?
Okay, so we've gone pretty deep into this dark territory of soldiers turning into predators. We've talked about the psychological factors, the historical examples, even how our own culture might be playing a role. But now I'm ready for some solutions. What can we actually do to prevent this from happening?
That's the question, right? After a deep dive like this, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, maybe even a little hopeless. But the good news is, we're not powerless. There are things we can do, both as individuals and as a society.
So where do we start? The excerpts talked about PTSD, but we've established it's not a simple cause and effect thing.
Right, PTSD is often part of the puzzle, but rarely the whole picture. That said, we have to improve how we treat it. For way too long, mental health has been stigmatized within the military, seen as a weakness. We need a complete culture shift.
So making it easier for soldiers to get help without worrying about judgment or repercussions on their career? Exactly. We need a massive investment in mental health resources, specifically for veterans. Therapists who are trained in trauma, PTSD, support networks that are readily available. And this can't just be an afterthought, something we deal with once someone's already in crisis. It needs to start way earlier.
The excerpts also mentioned changing the way we actually train soldiers. What does that look like?
Well, right now, the focus is very much on physical and tactical skills, right? How to shoot, how to strategize, how to survive in a combat situation. But what about the mental and emotional skills they need to deal with what they're experiencing?
So equipping them to handle not just the act of killing, but the moral and psychological burden that comes with it.
Precisely. Imagine if we incorporated mindfulness techniques for stress management, training on ethical decision-making, even under extreme pressure, communication skills, how to de-escalate conflict.
It's almost like preparing them for the human cost of war, not just the physical one. But the book also called out our own culture, which is a much harder thing to change.
It's uncomfortable to admit, but we can't just lay all the blame on individual soldiers when we live in a society that's so saturated with violence. Movies, video games, the news. It desensitizes us, all to some extent. But for someone who's already struggling, it can be fuel to the fire.
So are we talking about censoring violent content? That seems both impossible and like it could backfire.
I don't think censorship is the answer, but critical thinking is. We need to be more aware of how we're consuming violence, the messages it's sending, and the potential impact, especially on younger minds.
So more media literacy, basically.
Yeah.
Teaching people to analyze what they're seeing, not just passively absorbing it.
Exactly. And also being more mindful of the language we use when talking about war, about the enemy. Dehumanization often starts subtly, but it makes violence so much easier to justify.
It's like, even if we can't single-handedly stop all wars, we can at least push back against the glamorization of violence that makes them more likely to happen.
And that pushback happens on multiple fronts. Supporting veterans' mental health, training soldiers more holistically, having those tough conversations about the impact of violence in our entertainment. It all contributes to a larger shift.
So what you're saying is there's no one magic solution, but a bunch of smaller things we can each do that collectively make a difference.
That's exactly it. And each of us has a role to play, whether it's supporting organizations that help veterans, having those uncomfortable conversations with family and friends about this stuff, or even just choosing to consume media that doesn't glorify violence. It all matters. It all contributes to a cultural shift.
Honestly, that's kind of inspiring. This deep dive started out so dark, but knowing that there are things we can do, that gives me hope.
Hope is crucial, because if we believe these tragedies are inevitable, we become part of the problem. But if we believe that change is possible, that we can build a world where soldiers are truly protectors, not predators, well, that belief becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well said. This has been an incredible deep dive. Eye-opening, challenging, but ultimately, I feel like I've learned a lot. And more importantly, I feel empowered to do something with that knowledge.
That's what it's all about, isn't it? Moving from passive listening to active engagement. And for everyone who's joined us on this journey, we encourage you to keep exploring this topic, read more, have those difficult conversations, and most importantly, find ways to contribute to a world where violence isn't the default answer.
Thanks for listening, everyone. And remember, knowledge is power, but action is what truly changes the world.